While cleaning up the blue paint that her son has accidentally spilled on the floor, a single mother hears the doorbell and gets up to answer the door. However, when she arrives outside, she finds no one there. Minutes later, the woman packs her bags to meet her friend at the port of the city at 8:30, as he has invited her on a boat trip. That morning, Greg receives a couple of friends on his boat for a sail and discovers that Sally has brought a friend to pair up with him. Just then, Jess appears and Greg realizes that she's not well, so he tells her that they can leave the ride for another day. However, Jess insists on sailing with her friends and, during the trip, she dreams that she has woken up alone on the beach. When she opens her eyes, the woman realizes that it was all just a dream and is relieved to be safe on the boat. At that moment, Greg talks to Victor and asks what happened to Jess, as she seemed shaken. Then the young man says that when he met Jess, he asked her where her son was, because Tommy was supposed to be on that trip too, but she said she couldn't remember. After a few minutes of silence, the woman looked back at him and said that Tommy was at school, but Victor suspected that she wasn't telling the truth. Then Jess shows up and Greg decides to let her drive the boat in an attempt to cheer up his friend. Seeing Greg and Jess approaching, Sally gets upset and asks Heather to go and talk to him. When she finds out that the woman is a waitress and a single mother, Sally decides to do everything she can to get in the way of their romance, because she doesn't want to see her friend around someone she thinks isn't good enough for him. Suddenly, during the ride, the wind stops completely and the boat is stranded in the middle of the ocean. Although he finds this situation very strange, Greg is not alarmed, as his boat also has engines, so they will have no problem getting home. While preparing to leave and return to the beach, the pilot and his crew come across a huge storm approaching and Greg immediately tries to contact the Coast Guard for help. However, in the middle of the call, the signal is interrupted and the pilot hears a woman's voice calling for help over the radio. The woman claims that there is someone on her ship attacking all the crew and only she has managed to survive. Suddenly, the call is interrupted and Greg realizes that help won't arrive in time. Realizing that the storm is getting worse, he orders everyone to grab their life jackets and hide inside the boat. When he sees the seawater invading the boat, Greg realizes that his ship is about to sink and orders Victor to cut the sails. Even so, the boat ends up being hit by gigantic waves and, at the moment of the collision, Heather ends up being dragged out through the window. Minutes after the accident, the survivors start looking for the young woman, but they can't find her. Now, the only way out is to climb into the hull of the boat and wait until someone shows up to rescue them. A few hours later, a gigantic ship appears and begins to approach the wreck. Relieved to know that they will receive help, the four friends cheer up, but Jess has the terrible feeling that something is wrong. Even though she is terrified, she accompanies the team and enters the sinister ship. Believing that they are safe, Downey and Greg, who have been friends since college, hug and celebrate the rescue while Sally cries knowing that Heather won't be coming home with them. While Victor begins to search the place for other passengers, Jess looks around and has the strange feeling that this ship is familiar, as if she had been on board before. The next step is to find the captain and ask him to contact the Coast Guard so that they can send a helicopter to look for Heather. But as they walk, the team begins to wonder where everyone is, as they can't find a single person walking down the corridors. Seeing Jess paralyzed, Greg asks if she's all right and the woman says that for some reason she feels like she's been there before, because she recognizes that corridor. While looking at some pictures on display, Victor and Downey discover that the ship was built in 1932 and is called HELLISH. This name refers to the god of the winds, father of Sisyphus, a human who was condemned by the gods to push a rock up a mountain only to see it roll back down. Suddenly, Greg hears a noise coming from the next corridor and decides to go there to see if he can find anyone. Victor immediately decides to accompany him and finds a bunch of keys lying on the floor. When she sees it, Jess is terrified and says that the bunch of keys belongs to her. Knowing that those keys were on the yacht, Sally comes to the conclusion that her friend survived and is also on board the ship. However, her husband claims that this would be impossible, as Heather would never leave a clue instead of appearing in the flesh to tell her friends that she is alive. Arriving in the dining room, Sally starts shouting for her friend, but gets no response. Everyone is already nervous about being the only people on the ship when, suddenly, Jess realizes that someone is watching them. Determined to solve this mystery, Victor goes after this mysterious person, then Greg and Jess decide to go after him. The woman is terrified and says that Victor is in danger, but Greg doesn't listen to what she has to say, as he believes that Jess is just suffering symptoms of stress. While arguing, the couple hears a noise coming from one of the suites and goes in to investigate. When they enter the bathroom, they see a note written on the mirror asking them to walk to the theater. When she comes across those letters written in blood, Jess panics, but Greg tries to stay calm and finds out where the theater is. Determined to get off the ship before something bad happens, Jess returns to the salon and Greg has no choice but to go it alone. While walking through the corridors, Sally and Downey spot some bloodstains on the floor and decide to follow them in an attempt to find Heather. In doing so, the couple end up in the theater and Jess starts looking for them in the dining room. Suddenly, she spots Victor approaching and realizes that he is completely covered in blood. Worried about her friend, Jess approaches him to ask what happened, but ends up being attacked. While the man tries to eliminate her, Jess looks for a way to defend herself and attacks him back. Just then, she finds a wound on the back of the young man's head and uses this weakness against him. When she finally manages to defeat Victor and get rid of the attack, Jess hears the sound of a gunshot and rushes over to check that her friends are all right. When she arrives at the theater, she finds the couple trying to help Greg, but the man loses it due to the gunshot wound. When she sees Jess approaching, Sally starts screaming and asks why she did it, because before he lost his life Greg said it was Jess who shot him. Without understanding what is happening, the woman says that she couldn't have done it, because she was in the salon with Victor. Downey then asks why Jess asked them to go to the theater and the woman assures him that she didn't say anything either. Furious at all those lies, the couple starts to spew hatred at the waitress and suddenly they are both hit by shots coming from the second floor of the theater. Terrified, Jess and her friends hide, but the shooting continues and Downey ends up being eliminated. While Sally mourns the loss of her husband, Jess gets up and tries to drag her out of there. However, halfway through, the woman ends up being hit by another shot and is eliminated, so Jess abandons her body and runs away so as not to become the next victim. During the escape, she runs to the kitchen and grabs a knife to defend herself if necessary. The woman is hiding when she senses the presence of her enemy approaching, so she waits until the gunman leaves so she can continue her escape. On reaching the upper deck, Jess comes across the lifeboats and runs to them, but ends up being hit on the head and falls to the ground. Just as her enemy was about to shoot, the woman managed to hold the barrel of the gun and deflect the bullet. After taking down the shooter, Jess runs downstairs and tries to hide behind the stairs, but is still being chased. When he finds his target, the man starts firing again and, when his ammunition runs out, he throws his gun at Jess's head. After being hit, the woman falls to the ground and immediately gets up to continue her escape. While running in search of a safe place, Jess finds an axe hanging on the wall and uses it to fight off her attacker. During the duel, she tries to find out who that person is and why they are eliminating everyone. Then, without removing his mask, the man says that Jess must eliminate the crew members who arrive on that ship, because that's the only way to get home. Upon hearing these words, Jess realizes that it is a woman who is underneath that mask and attacks her. To dodge the blow, her opponent is forced to throw herself into the ocean, so the waitress breathes a sigh of relief at having managed to defeat her. Just then, she hears music coming from inside the ship and walks towards it until she comes across a record player. Minutes later, while looking in the mirror, Jess hears some people calling for help and, as she looks out at the ocean, she comes across the same wrecked boat that took her friends there. When she sees the same scene repeated, Jess feels confused and distraught, as she has no idea what is going on. Not knowing how to explain the fact that there are two versions of herself, Jess decides to hide and watch the members of her team as they take the same route she took minutes ago. Desperate, the woman crouches down and begins to cry as she wonders what to do. Just then, her keys fall out of her pocket and she has to run so that her friends don't see her. During her escape, the waitress ends up in the same suite where she found the note on the mirror earlier and decides to go out for a moment while she thinks about how to resolve the situation. At this point, Jess sees Downey's body floating in the sea being devoured by seagulls and is terrified to see a bloodstain on the railings of the parapet. To make matters worse, Victor suddenly appears, so she tries to explain what's going on and claims that the bodies of her friends are scattered all over the ship. Upon hearing this, the young man comes to the conclusion that Jess has lost it and decides to ignore her. When she realizes she's not being taken seriously, the woman pushes Victor against the wall to try and stop him from going to meet his friends, because if he does, they'll all lose their lives soon. At that moment, she accidentally pushes the young man's head against a hook, causing a deep wound to his skull. Terrified of realizing that she was the real culprit behind the elimination of her friend, Jess decides to run away and once again goes to meet the other members of the team. When she realizes that everything is repeating itself exactly as it did minutes ago, the woman decides to hide so as not to risk hurting anyone else and ends up in the changing room. When she gets there, she finds dozens of sheets of paper scattered on the floor with a note saying to eliminate everyone who boards. To make sure that it really is her handwriting, Jess takes a pencil and writes the same thing in a notebook. At this point, she realizes that she is stuck in that loop, because this same scene has been repeated countless times. While searching the place, the woman finds the jumpsuit the shooter was wearing and also a locker full of guns. Terrified, Jess realizes that the person who wiped out her entire crew was herself and decides to follow her clone's advice, believing that this is her only chance of returning home and reuniting with her son. After picking up the shotgun, the waitress walks through the ship's corridors and finds Victor. After apologizing for the incident, she says she'll try to get the whole team off the ship, but when she sees her other version coming down the stairs, Jess decides to eliminate her. However, just as she is about to pull the trigger, she gives up on completing the job, as it would turn her into a criminal. At this point, her double takes the opportunity to run away and Jess asks Victor to hold on until she can get the other members of the group together. Suddenly, the woman hears the sound of a gunshot and runs into the theater, where she finds Greg lifeless. Determined to save Sally and Downey, Jess shoots her other self and helps the couple escape. Her aim is to change the pattern of that loop, as she believes that this way they won't be trapped on the ship. After handing Downey the shotgun, Jess orders him to shoot anyone who comes along and goes after Victor so that they can all get off that ship together. However, when she arrives in the main hall, the waitress doesn't find him and decides to follow the trail of blood, which leads to the outside of the ship. Meanwhile, her evil version goes after Downey and Sally and claims that Victor lost his life because he fell into the sea. After saying this, the evil clone convinces the couple to follow her into one of the bedrooms and waits for the right moment to stab them. Hearing her friend's screams, Jess runs towards them to try and help them and finds Sally crawling down the corridor. While Downey is eliminated with numerous blows, the woman manages to escape from the suite and runs away when she sees Jess approaching. Terrified, the woman runs to the engine room and, while looking for somewhere to hide, she finds a radio. Without thinking twice, Sally turns on the device to ask for help and says that there is a woman on her ship eliminating everyone. Suddenly, she hears Greg's voice answering her call, but she can't stay on the line as she realizes that Jess has managed to find her. Immediately, Sally climbs the stairs to get to the top floor and, when she goes after her, Jess comes across countless copies of the woman who was eliminated there earlier. Even seeing all those bodies, Sally refuses to believe that there are other copies of Jess on the ship and loses her life blaming the waitress for causing the elimination of the entire team. While trying to regain her friend's trust, Jess sees other versions of herself fighting with each other and one of them ends up throwing the other into the ocean. After Sally and all the other crew members have gone, the looping starts again and, once again, Jess hears the voice of her shipwrecked friends approaching the ship. In an attempt to stop all the eliminations that are to come, Jess tries to stop the ship, but is unsuccessful, so her only option is to watch the whole process happening all over again. At that moment, the woman walks into the suite and uses Downey's blood to write a message on the mirror. She then drags her friend's body to the edge of the ship and throws it into the sea. After disposing of Greg's body, she walks to the salon and asks her friends to gather in the theater. Knowing that it is now her turn to fire, Jess returns to the locker room and puts on her black jumpsuit to begin the attack. After hiding behind a hood, the woman goes after Greg and points her gun at him. When he realizes that his life is in danger, the man tries to argue and, when he looks at the shooter's feet, he recognizes Jess's shoes. At this point, Greg asks why her friend wants to eliminate him, so Jess says that she needs to get rid of all the crew members so that the looping can restart. Her plan is to wait at the boarding point so that next time she can stop her friends from getting on that ship. In this way, the woman believes she will be able to save them all, so, even against her will, she shoots Greg and the man ends up falling into the bleachers. While Sally and Downey try to understand what happened, Jess puts new cartridges in her gun and starts shooting wildly. After eliminating the couple, the woman goes after her double and hits her in the head. After knocking her out, Jess pulls the trigger, but her clone manages to dodge the shot and get away. During her escape, the waitress finds an axe and uses it to defend herself against Jess's blows, who is determined to eliminate her at any cost. Once again, however, history repeats itself and the woman in the hood ends up losing the duel. After instructing her clone to eliminate all the crew members who arrive on the ship, Jess jumps into the sea to avoid being hit. A few hours later, the waitress wakes up on the beach and realizes that she has been saved by the current. When she realizes that she has finally managed to free herself from that ship, she is relieved and walks to the side of the road to try to catch a ride home. When she arrives in her neighborhood, Jess sees her neighbor mowing the lawn and realizes that everything is exactly as it was when she left to meet Greg at the port. At that moment, she takes a peek in the window and sees her son painting on a sheet of paper, but her nightmare begins again when she realizes that there is another version of her living in that house. If she wants to get her life back, Jess knows she'll have to make the hardest decision of her life, but when she sees her past self fighting with Tommy, she knows for sure what she has to do. When he looks out of the window, the boy sees his mother's copy and gets scared, so he accidentally knocks over the pot of blue paint. Furious, Jess slaps the youngster and the boy runs scared to his room. Determined to get rid of her version of the past, Jess rings the doorbell and, after grabbing a hammer from the tool shed, she infiltrates the house. Minutes later, the woman attacks her other self and eliminates her with numerous blows, but ends up being caught by Tommy, who is completely terrified at seeing the scene. After reassuring the boy and convincing him that it was all just a bad dream, Jess puts her own body in a bag and hides it in the trunk of the car. That afternoon, the waitress decides to leave town with her son and, on the way, promises that she will never stress about him again, no matter what happens. Suddenly, a pigeon hits the windshield and Jess decides to get out of the car to bury it. After parking the car, she asks Tommy to wait for her inside and throws the bird's body on the beach. As she does so, she realizes that there are countless pigeons' bodies in the sand and she begins to get a strange feeling, as if she were still stuck in that loop. Frightened, the woman runs back to her car and drives away. However, during the journey, Tommy is startled by the blood marks on the windshield and Jess becomes distracted, letting her vehicle swerve across the road. She ends up colliding with a truck and her car flips over. Minutes after the accident, many people show up to help the victims, but find both mother and son lifeless. By some miracle, Jess managed to survive and the woman who was found at the scene of the accident was her copy. Driven by the desire to get her son back, the woman finds a taxi driver and asks him to take her to the port. And so her journey to board the ship begins again. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.